You know what's funny? We've always been obsessed with catching criminals. Fingerprint powder, DNA databases, facial recognition software. We spent billions trying to make sure nobody could get away with anything. And then one day, someone's grandmother uploaded her DNA to find out if she was actually Irish. She wasn't. But she did solve a 30-year-old burglary ring. Welcome back. If you're new here, the algorithm's probably playing some weird game with you right now, so like and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy sitting in the dark with me. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Go ahead. Set the mood. Dim the lights. Get comfortable. Turn on a fan if you have one, and I know you do, because it's currently 2 a.m. and you're thinking about your electric bill and whether the person who follows your running route is just a coincidence or a future Dateline episode. Here's what I want to know before we start. What did people do before fingerprint powder existed? Just hope criminals were born with their names tattooed on their foreheads? And why do the dumbest criminals always run like they've just discovered their legs for the first time? Like they watched a single parkour video and thought, yeah, that's my getaway strategy. But this is different. This isn't about a panicked teenager or a desperate drug dealer. This is about someone who was patient, methodical. Someone who understood that the perfect crime isn't the one that never happens. It's the one that's forgotten. Congratulations. You've just woken up in the middle of a cold case that refused to stay cold. Some people blend in so well that you don't even see them. That's not tragic or poetic. That's just how suburbs work. Let's talk about Robert. Not his real name. Nobody's real name tonight. Robert lived on Maple Street in a mid-sized Ohio town where the biggest crime was usually someone's dog getting loose or Karen complaining about the new mailbox color. He was quiet. Worked a decent job. Kept the yard acceptable. His neighbors couldn't tell you much about him because, honestly, who really keeps track of the divorced guy 3 houses down? Routine is what allowed Robert to exist without existing. He'd leave for work at 7:45 a.m. Home by 5:30 p.m. Sometimes the grocery store on Thursdays. Never made a scene. Never was the person at the neighborhood cookout who told the same story 3 times. He was the guy everyone's mother liked because he wasn't memorable in any way that mattered. That's the thing about people in their 50s who've been alone for a while, they become ghosts in real estate. Present but unregistered. The kind of person the local news anchor wouldn't remember interviewing 5 minutes after the camera stopped rolling. But here's where the story gets interesting. Because while Robert was doing his taxes in Excel and eating microwave dinners, there was something else happening. Something that only made sense if you knew what you were looking for. And nobody was looking. Not yet. Not for another 3 decades. By the time anyone actually paid attention, they'd find something else hiding in that routine, the small receipt from the home improvement store. The one from 1993. The one that would eventually connect to something much bigger. The mundane, it turns out, is the perfect place to hide. Nobody photographs the ordinary. Let's talk about the neighbors. They've been watching you. Not because they're suspicious. Because it's what people do. And sometimes, without meaning to, they see something they can't unsee. Between 1992 and 1996, a series of burglaries happened across 3 Ohio counties. 23 homes. 23 times someone came in when nobody was home. 23 times they took specific things, jewelry, cash, sometimes nothing at all. The randomness was the real mystery. No forced entry. No signs of rage. Whoever was doing this wasn't angry at the homeowners. Wasn't trying to send a message. was just taking things. Like they were checking something off a list. The local police looked at the obvious people first. The recently unemployed. The drug addicts. The guys with prior records. But this felt different. This felt like someone with a key. Or someone who knew how to make it look that way. The news called them the polite burglar. Not because they were nice. Because they left things undisturbed. Walked through the living room like a guest who was trying not to be rude. Turned a lamp off before they left. Detectives interviewed over 200 people. Most of them twice. They didn't have DNA databases back then. They had hunches and paper files and the creeping feeling that they were missing something obvious. The kind of feeling that keeps you awake at 3 a.m., staring at a wall covered in Polaroids and red string, wondering if you're crazy or just not looking in the right direction. The files went cold. That's the term they use. Like the case died of hypothermia. Like it was alive once but nobody was paying attention when it needed help. Then, somehow, everyone just moved on. There's no statute of limitations on mystery, but there is on attention. And attention is expensive. 28 years later, someone would wonder about those files again. But first, they'd have to be looking. You ever notice how weird it is that we know more about dead people now than we did about living people 30 years ago? Sarah was a genealogy enthusiast. Not the obsessive kind who names their kids after ancestor combinations. Just curious. She had a normal job, a small apartment, and that particular brand of restless energy that comes from being alone with the internet at 10 p.m. She'd uploaded her DNA to one of those ancestry sites everyone uses now. You know the ones. The websites that promise to tell you what you already know. You're part Swedish, part Irish, definitely part confused about why this costs $45. Sarah wasn't looking for crime. She was looking for her biological grandfather. Her mother had been adopted. The mystery had lived in their family like an uninvited relative who shows up to dinners and nobody talks about. But here's where algorithms do something beautiful and weird: they connect things. Sarah's DNA wasn't an exact match to anyone in her family tree. It was close. Extremely close. Like a second cousin she'd never heard about. So she started digging. Because that's what genealogy people do. They dig until something breaks or something clicks. What she found was Robert. Not directly at first. Just a name on a database. A man who'd also uploaded his DNA. A man whose genetic map suggested he might have had a biological connection to her grandmother's brother. A man she'd never met. A man who, on the surface, looked like nothing at all. She messaged him through the website. Casual. Hey, we might be related. Got curious about my family tree. Do you know anything about connection to the Hendersons? Robert responded within hours. Which was odd. Most people don't respond that fast. Most people are living their lives. Robert, apparently, was waiting. They exchanged information for 3 weeks. He seemed nice. Seemed normal. Seemed like the kind of person who cared about his family history. But Sarah had been on the internet long enough to know that seeming normal is sometimes the easiest thing a person can do. Then, completely unrelated, Sarah stumbled across an old archived newspaper article. She wasn't looking for it. Someone on a Reddit true crime forum had linked it. The Polite Burglar. She read it for fun. Then she read Robert's biography again. Then she did something most people wouldn't think to do: she looked up his address. And there it was. Maple Street, Ohio. The same town where the burglaries happened. The same county. The same era. Sarah didn't call the police immediately. She did what people do. She Googled Robert. She scrolled through his Facebook photos from 2008 to 2015. She looked at his job history. She tried to convince herself she was insane. Then she called the detectives. Not the local ones. The state police. And she said something that would make them move. This is where it gets complicated. Because understanding why someone commits a crime doesn't make them less guilty. It just makes them real. Robert's life, if you looked at it from the outside, seemed fine. Stable. But stability and satisfaction are two different things. And Robert had been barely surviving since his early 20s. His marriage ended in 1991. Not dramatically. Just quietly. His wife left because she was tired. Tired of the silences. Tired of feeling like she was married to someone who was already gone. She took their son. Robert kept the house and a job he'd had since 1987 at a heating and cooling company. The kind of work that pays the bills but doesn't fill anything inside. By 1992, Robert was 43 years old. Alone. Angry in the way quiet people get angry, not explosive, but thorough. He'd look at his life and wonder how it became this. Not someone who did things. Not someone who mattered. Just someone who showed up and went home. The burglaries started small. He told himself it was reconnaissance. Scouting. He'd knock on doors. When nobody answered, he'd look in windows. See how people lived. See what they had. See what was possible. At some point, looking wasn't enough. The first house he actually entered, he didn't mean to take anything. He just wanted to be inside. To see how other people arranged their lives. He left through the back door with a watch. Nothing valuable. Nothing that would hurt anyone. Just something to prove he could do it. The second one was easier. The third became routine. By the fifth, Robert understood something fundamental: he wasn't taking things. He was collecting proof. Proof that he existed. Proof that he was capable. Proof that his life could be more than the thing he was actually living. Between burglaries, Robert would go home and look at what he'd taken. Jewelry he'd never wear. Cash he didn't need. Cash that sat in a shoebox under his bed, untouched. Because the money was never the point. The stealing was the point. The choice was the point. The fact that he could do something nobody could stop him from doing was the point. He'd wake up in the morning and go to work. Come home. Eat dinner alone. And somewhere between routine and isolation, he'd convince himself to go back out. It's easy to judge him. Easy to say he was just bad. But addiction works the same way whether it's legal or not. And Robert was addicted to the feeling of being capable. To the temporary belief that he was a person who could change his circumstances. He just picked the wrong circumstances to change. We're all just storage units walking around. Memories. Objects. Lies we've perfected over time. In 2024, when the investigators finally executed a search warrant on Robert's house, the house he'd lived in for 32 years, they found something in the basement. Behind a false panel in his workbench. A wooden box about the size of a bread maker. Inside were photographs. 27 homes, documented from the inside. Not crime scene photos. Just pictures Robert had taken. Interior shots. Pictures of living rooms. Bedrooms. Kitchens where other people's lives happened. Some had dates written on the back. Some didn't need them. You could see the calendar change in the trees outside the windows. There were also receipts. The store where he'd bought the materials. A key copying place he visited in 1993. Gas station receipts from towns where he'd never lived but where burglaries occurred. Nothing incriminating individually. Together, they were a confession written in carbon paper and fading ink. But the photographs were the real secret. Because they showed something investigators hadn't expected. Some of them weren't just random interiors. Some of them contained family photos. Kids in baseball uniforms. Couples on vacation. Elderly people smiling in their own homes. Robert had taken pictures of these photographs inside the homes. Photographing other people's photographed memories. The psychologist brought in by the state police had a field day with that. What kind of person doesn't just steal from you? What kind of person documents that they were there? What kind of person saves evidence of his own crimes and keeps it for 30 years? Someone lonely, probably. Someone trying to build a museum of evidence that he'd mattered. Someone trying to prove to himself that he'd been somewhere, doing something, existing in spaces where other people's real lives happened. The box also contained money. Not the money from the burglaries. Robert had spent most of that in the years it happened. This was different. This was cash, almost $15,000, accumulated over decades. Money Robert had saved but never spent. Money that was clearly important to him. Investigators theorized it was meant as restitution. That somewhere, in whatever passed for Robert's conscience, he knew what he'd done and was trying to make it right the only way his isolation would allow, by hoarding proof. No note, though. No confession. Just the box. Just the photographs. Just evidence that someone had lived, even if the way he lived was by breaking into other people's homes and stealing their peace of mind. The secrets people keep are usually less about hiding something and more about preserving it. Robert had preserved his entire second life in a wooden box. And now, whether he wanted to or not, everyone knew. Here's something that nobody talks about: the future doesn't solve old crimes. Luck does. Luck in a genealogy website and a woman who decided to wonder about her family. When Sarah contacted the state police, they didn't immediately believe her. Why would they? A woman from 3 states away connecting dots based on DNA overlap and the fact that a guy lived in the same town where crimes happened decades ago? That's not evidence. That's a theory. That's the kind of thing that sounds crazy until it becomes specific. But the detectives assigned to the case, there was a detective assigned specifically because cold cases get resources now, it's become fashionable to solve them, decided to run with it. They pulled Robert's name against the burglary database. Nothing came up. No arrests. No suspicion. No record. So they did something basic: they asked Robert to come in for a conversation. Not an arrest. Just a conversation. The kind where you sit in a room and a detective asks you questions and you either lie or tell the truth or do both at the same time. Robert agreed. That was the first problem. Guilty people usually lawyer up immediately. Robert showed up with his hands shaking and his face already surrendering. He wasn't surprised they'd found him. He was surprised it took this long. He didn't deny anything. Not the burglaries. Not the box. Not the photographs. He just sat there and answered questions about a person he didn't even recognize anymore. A person from another era. A person he'd been but had stopped being sometime around the time the internet started and the world got bigger and smaller simultaneously. The DNA evidence wasn't technically used in prosecution. It was leverage. It was the thing that made the investigation possible. It was the reason anyone looked at Robert at all. Because without Sarah's curiosity and the genealogy website and the algorithm that suggested they might be related, Robert would probably have died in that house, alone, with the box still hidden in the basement, still unwitnessed. Forensic genealogy, that's what they call it now, had become legitimate. It's used in major cases. It's solved murders. It's reunited families. But it's also, apparently, the reason a quiet man's 30-year-old crime finally stopped being theoretical and became a case that needed closing. The other victims were contacted. Decades later, they came forward with stories about the violation. About the feeling of knowing someone had been in their space. The strange, specific violation that only makes sense if you understand that being robbed of objects is one thing. Being robbed of privacy is another. Robert was charged with 23 counts of burglary. He didn't fight it. He didn't claim he was a different person now, though technically he was. He just accepted it like he'd been accepting most things his entire life, as something that happened to him, not something he'd done. He was 72 years old when he went to prison. Nobody writes about 72-year-old burglars. They're not interesting. They don't fit the narrative. But they exist. And sometimes, the algorithm finds them anyway. The strange thing about solving a crime this old is that everyone's moved on. The original investigators have retired. The victims have rebuilt their lives around the violation. The town has forgotten it even happened. And then, suddenly, it's real again. It's present. It's someone's job. Robert's case went through the legal system and what felt like fast forward to everyone except Robert, who experienced it in real time, which meant it felt endless. Arraignment. Preliminary hearing. The option to plead guilty, which he took. Sentencing. Throughout it all, Robert said very little. He answered questions. He acknowledged facts. He behaved like a man who'd been waiting 3 decades for someone to notice him, and now that someone had, he was almost relieved. The victims got restitution. Not for the money, though that was included. For the violation itself. The recognition that what had happened to them mattered. That it was being taken seriously. That a man had spent 30 years living in their homes in his head, photographing their memories, and now, finally, the photographs were evidence of something. Robert's son, the boy who'd been 7 when his parents divorced, came to the trial. He was 40 now. He hadn't known his father well. He'd been raised by his mother in another state. He had no relationship with Robert beyond the biological accident of it. But he came anyway, because that's what people do when their parents become famous for the wrong reasons. After the sentencing, Robert's son stood outside the courthouse and told a reporter, "I didn't know him. But now I do. And it doesn't make sense to me that someone can live in the same world and be invisible until they do something we can finally see." The court sentenced Robert to 12 years. Not a lifetime. 12 years. Because at 72, with no prior record, committing crimes he'd committed 3 decades ago, the legal system decided that seemed about right. Proportional. Fair in the abstract way that justice sometimes is. Robert died in prison in 2027. Heart attack. He was 75. He'd spent 3 years there. He didn't complete the sentence. But he did complete something else. He became a person. Not a ghost. Not a routine. Not a man who didn't exist. He became Robert the burglar. Robert the invisible criminal. Robert the man the algorithm caught. It's not a better identity, necessarily. It's just a real one. The house on Maple Street was sold. The new owners didn't know about the box or the photographs or the man who'd lived there before them, stealing from his neighbors and storing evidence of his own inadequacy in the basement. The realtor didn't mention it. Why would they? That's not the kind of history you disclose. Sarah, the genealogy enthusiast who started it all, stopped uploading her DNA to databases. She didn't want to solve any more cold cases. She didn't want to be the person who caught someone. She wanted to find her grandfather. But the algorithm had other plans. The algorithm was already working on the next mystery. The next connection. The next ghost hiding in someone's family tree. And somewhere in Ohio, the other victims got a call saying the case was closed. Saying the person who'd been in their homes had been found. Saying the violation had finally been named and prosecuted and resolved in a way that the legal system considers resolved. They hung up the phone and went back to their lives, which is what people do. Except now, they could go back to them knowing that someone had seen their homes. Knowing that it mattered enough to investigate. Knowing that invisibility, even for 30 years, isn't actually permanent. The algorithm had remembered, even when they forgot to. There's something we need to talk about before you close this tab and try to sleep. Tonight, we watched a man exist for 30 years in almost perfect invisibility. We watched him build a second life in the margins of his real one. We watched him collect evidence of his own breaking like it was evidence of his own mattering. And we watched the algorithm, that strange, indifferent force we've all learned to live alongside, finally notice him. Finally see him. Finally make him real. But here's what Robert's story actually teaches us: invisibility isn't a superpower. It's a consequence. It's what happens when someone falls so far out of the world that the only way they can feel present is to intrude on other people's presence. The burglaries weren't crimes born from greed or rage. They were cries for attention wearing the mask of theft. And that matters, because it means something was broken long before Robert broke into those homes. Something in the structure. Something in how we live near each other without seeing each other. Something in how a person can spend decades in the same town, working the same job, living in the same house, and never once be truly known. The victims of Robert's burglaries, they deserved better. They deserved to feel safe in their own spaces. They deserved to not spend years wondering if they were next. And they also deserved to know, in the end, that the violation that happened to them was real enough to finally warrant attention. To finally be prosecuted. To finally matter. But Robert deserved something too. He deserved to be seen before he had to steal to prove he existed. He deserved a world that didn't let him disappear. He deserved to matter without having to violate someone else's peace to do it. The genealogy database that caught him, that's not a villain in this story. It's a mirror. It's proof that we're all connected now. All searchable. All discoverable. The algorithms know more about us than we know about ourselves. They can trace us through DNA and data and the digital breadcrumbs we leave behind without thinking. And sometimes, that's just as finally arriving. Sometimes, it's the invisible becoming visible. You're watching this at 2 a.m. in your bedroom, or your living room, or some corner of your house where you're alone with a screen and your thoughts. Someone built that house. Someone painted those walls. Someone made choices about where you live and how you live and whether or not you're safe. And somewhere nearby, maybe 3 houses down, maybe in the next state, there's a person living their own quiet life. Living their own breaking. Living their own invisibility. Be kind to them. Not because they might be criminals, but because you don't know what's happening inside their isolation. You don't know what brought them to the place they're standing. You don't know if they're one small act of recognition away from choosing differently. And maybe, just maybe, that's the real gift of catching someone like Robert. It's not closure. It's a reminder. A reminder that the people we ignore are real. The lives we don't see are happening anyway. The violations we forget about are still being felt by someone, somewhere, carrying them into their future. The next case is waiting. It's colder than this one. It's stranger. It's the kind of mystery that keeps you awake not because of what happened, but because of what it means that it happened. Because of what it says about the world we built and the people we left behind in the construction. But before you click next, before you slide into the next story, think about this. What would you do if you discovered your own family was carrying a secret like Robert's? What would you do if the algorithm led you to someone you loved? What would you do if visibility meant betrayal? Comment below. Tell us. Tell us where you are. Tell us if you've ever felt invisible. Tell us if you've ever been afraid of what the algorithm might know about you. And thank you. Thank you for sitting in the dark with us. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about cold cases and old crimes and the quiet people living on quiet streets who might be breaking silently into the homes next to yours. Like this video. Subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to know they're seen. Because the algorithm is always watching. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's watching for you. Sleep well. The next case will be waiting when you wake up.